Awesome. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Just make sure okay, we're recording. We're good. I hope everybody's having a good day today. Very excited to head out next week, leaving Monday for to get down to North Carolina for the Aggression in Dogs conference and excited to be able to go visit some friends. Hi, Trish. Nice to see you. Yeah, it's sunny up here in Vermont too. We're actually in a pretty severe drought right now, which is a little wild for Vermont to be in a drought after we've had so much flooding earlier this summer. But I'm still, I know, enjoying this sunny weather. So I'm going down to North Carolina next week just to give you guys an idea of what I've been up to. And I'm very excited to be bringing my colleague Emily Lewis with me. If you guys have seen any of my videos, especially if you were at the Dog Aggression Dogs conference last year, Emily's in probably half of my videos when we were doing shelter behavior assessments. So we call each other our ride or die. And so I'm very excited she's coming. And then we're going to go down and visit a friend of mine at a shelter in South Carolina and do some play groups with her and her behavior team there. So that's pretty exciting. And then I think we're going to head up to Pibble Farm. If you all know who Trish McMillan is, she invited Emily and I to go visit the farm, and she has a new miniature horse there. And we're going to do some clicker training with the horse. So all of that is before the conference even starts, so I'm very excited. And I hope that some of you who are on here today or anybody that you guys know are coming to that conference. It's going to be really great, or maybe listening to it from afar. So today, though, what we're going to be talking about is unpacking shelter stress and how we can do some small things within our operations and organizational structure. Yeah, I'm excited. Thanks, Trish and Krista. I'm very excited. I haven't been able to concentrate on work all week. But today, since today, my brain is in overdrive. I had way too much coffee today. I want to talk a lot about how we can do some really simple things throughout our day and encourage our teams to do these things to help reduce some of the stress for the animals as they're transitioning into shelter life. So if this is your first time here, I'm Laurie Lawless. I run shelter behavior integrations, and my whole goal is to help animal shelters, big and small, really start thinking about behavior as part of the entire animal's journey through the shelter instead of just being a separate department in which people come in and do some behavior modification and dog evals. Behavior is happening all the time around us. Dogs are always learning, and we're always learning from the dogs. And so I personally believe, just after all the years that I've been in sheltering, we need to be a lot more cohesive in how we're tackling these issues and challenges in the shelter environment. And I try to help shelters do that by integrating everybody to be on the same team so we can help dogs through their shelter journey and identify dogs who may be struggling or have challenges, and how we can take the resources that are within our own each and every individual shelter environment and then apply those to dogs based on a series of leveling instead of kind of throwing every resource at every single dog, because just like people, all dogs are different. So today we're going to be talking about stress in shelters, and of course we're going to be talking about just broad spectrum. What is stressful about being in the shelter? How are we identifying it? And then some tricks and tips that we can do to kind of make things a little bit less stressful. We can't eliminate all stress in the shelter, obviously, but we can make some changes about the way that we're interacting with the animals, or our team is interacting with the animals, that can definitely be beneficial. So let's talk first about some of the things that are stressful as animals are coming into the shelter. And we're going to be speaking specifically to dogs here, but it often applies to all of the animals that we get, whether you're doing dogs and cats or you also have small animals. Of course, there's a lot of different species specific stuff we could look into. We're going to be talking mostly about dogs today. So coming into a shelter for any dog is going to bring upon immediate confusion of their what their new environment looks like. Even if it's a dog who has been at the shelter before, there may be some familiarity to the environment. However, they've had this opportunity to leave and come back, and that in itself can be a little confusing for them because they have not chosen to do that. We want to remember that dogs are captive animals for most of us who, unless they're living out in the street and navigating their own world, they kind of have to plug along to wherever life dictates them based on our needs. And so when we can't really tell them, hey, we're going to the kennel or the shelter today, they kind of just have to figure that out and navigate it as they get there. So depending on where a dog has come from, that confusion can lead to that immediate kind of stress and complication. So for example, if we have a dog who is an older dog and has lived in a single home their whole life and then are surrendered to an animal shelter, that is going to be very challenging for them because that is an environment that they have never been in before previously, or maybe it's been a very long time. Maybe they were adopted as a younger dog. So that in and of itself is going to be very, very hard. And those dogs are going to likely struggle quite a bit more than a dog who is maybe at a shelter, adopted and returned within a year or two, or for a dog who may have been transferred through multiple shelters. At least there's a little bit of a familiarity with the sights and sounds and noises and chaos, the chaos of the shelter. It doesn't mean it's not going to be stressful for them, but it is going to impact dogs who have at least some familiarity with animal shelters. It's going to feel a little less overwhelming because those sight sounds and all of those things are not going to be as novel. As you know, when you walk into a new environment, you have to get the lay of the land. And I don't know if you've ever thought about going to like a music festival. Your first day there, you kind of have to figure out where the stages are. You have to figure out where the food trucks might be. You have to figure out where the water station is, where the bathrooms, just like those basic life things that you need to know if you're going to be living at a festival for 5 days. So in addition to some excitement about this being new, there's also a little bit of stress of trying to figure out where everything is. So that can be very confusing for a lot of dogs, and then the spectrum on that will change. We also have to think about the fact that they now need to adapt to a new routine. So every shelter I've been to, typically we're looking at 8 to 5 or 8 to 6. I know some shelters where some staff get there at 6 in the morning and they do feeding and first walks before the rest of the staff come in. So regardless, whatever your shelter's routines are something the dog is now going to have to transition into that routine. And it may be different than the routine they had just a couple days ago. So that, of course, they have to kind of figure out when am I going to the bathroom? Where am I going to the bathroom? They won't have control over what they're being fed. So they may have to adapt to a new type of food that they're ingesting. Their stomach needs to adjust to that. So oftentimes when our animals are coming in, they're also probably getting some vaccinations straight out the gate. And so we have to be cognizant that they're getting a lot of that handling right away so that that can happen. So there's a lot of steps that can create this onboarding stress for our animals as they're transitioning in. There's some things that they're going to lose in this transition process. Their ability to choose whether or not to interact or not interact with folks. So, in most shelters, it's like, oh, a new dog is here. They're right in the routine, and now we're going in and we're leashing and moving that dog. And these dogs haven't developed relationships yet with any of the staff or volunteers. Those first interactions may feel very overwhelming for them. And at the very least, anytime you meet a new person or a new animal, it's going to be maybe for some people exciting, but there's still a level of stress. So if we look at like kind of judging whether the stress is good stress or bad stress, it can sometimes be a little mix of both. So if we have dogs who are very pro-social and enjoy human and dog interaction, things like being asked to interact directly with a new person could be a little exciting, but also like they have to figure out who you are and what you're all about. And it's going to be the same with their dog friends. So even if we have a great playgroup program running and the dog really likes other dogs, we're still having to remember that this is a new experience and new interactions for them. And there is always going to be some like underlying level of novelty and potential excitement about the novelty. And also, this is all still new and overwhelming, and it's making the brain work quite a bit. We do have some dogs too who just don't want to interact. We've all seen, I should say, dogs who go to the back of the kennel and don't want to come out. And then we're battling, is it better to leave them there? Is it better to get them outside into the sunlight and get them to use the restroom outside so they're not going to the bathroom in their kennel? Or is it fair or is it worth it to force a dog into an actual interaction if it's going to benefit them on the other side of it? So these are all some of the things that we need to consider. A couple things just about the shelter environment itself is noise is obviously a big factor. Dogs can hear way better than humans can. So if the noise is affecting us, we need to remember that it's affecting the dogs that much more. Internal kennel lighting. If we have fluorescent lights, especially if they get tweaked and they might be kind of flickering and blinking, that can be really detrimental to the dogs as far as like what is going on, the stimulus going on in the environment. There's a restaurant up here in the islands in Vermont where I live. It's pretty rural, and it's like an old towny bar, and one of the fluorescent lights above the bar will sometimes flicker, and it's so frustrating. I have to actually move my seat because it does cause my brain to go bananas. So even things such as lighting fixtures can be sometimes stressful for the animals in our shelter. We also have a lot of cleaning products happening. So, in addition to dogs being able to smell all the other dogs around them and hear all the other dogs around them, we are also going through and using a lot of cleaning chemicals that eliminates a lot of odors. And so, what happens is the dogs primarily use their scent to become familiar with their environment. And then we're going through and cleaning that every day because we have to for sanitary reasons and disease transmission. And so we're basically giving them a clean slate a lot of the times, and that can be very stressful because the scents that were there yesterday are no longer there and have disappeared. That's why it is typically best practices that we're only deep cleaning if we absolutely need to in a specific animal kennel, and otherwise we are trying to keep things with their familiar scents with them throughout their stay. And so, strategies there would be, to take dirty items out, but maybe leave a cleanish blanket and a toy and then replacing with new stuff. So there's always a layer of familiar scent. So those are things that can be really helpful. It can be also the lack of scent if we are in a very urban environment and maybe can only walk dogs in parking lots. They may not have opportunities to sniff and gather scent from other dogs who have maybe urinated on a tree or found a curb or something. So that again is how dogs kind of familiarize themselves with the environment. So quick tips or tricks there is to kind of throw down some astroturf in the parking lot that you could wash at the end of the day, or building some type of box with either sand or astroturf. Sand is obviously not really cleanable, but I have seen sandboxes and dogs tend to like to poop and dig in them, which is kind of fun, but you have to pick it up right away. Other ideas for increasing scent is if you have some awesome volunteers, they can kind of get some planters and plant cilantro and mint and some other smell good items for dogs to be able to go around on their walk and sniff. Let's see. Oh, and the ability for them to make choices in their environment is something that I am talking a lot about in the new course that I'm putting out with Dr. Karen Griffin about our framework of dog needs. But we know that for safety and control and for our routine and for getting things done during the day, that we have to stick to cleaning the kennels, getting the dogs out for walks, distributing enrichment, things like that. However, what can be very helpful is identifying ways that within those contexts that the dogs have very little control over is adding some control to their environments. For example, I was just at a shelter recently that had two small dogs that had come in. They were an owner surrender. I think one was about 30 pounds and the other was a Chihuahua mix. And what they decided to do to help those dogs settle in, as they were older dogs who had been surrendered, had never been in a shelter before, is they created a space with a blanket in the corner, so the dogs could choose to lay on the blanket. Then they had an airline crate, which the dog could go into to hide one of the dogs. And then they had a little ramp, and then they put a blanket on top of the crate so the dog could choose to go up and be on top of the crate. And then we're giving them a couple different variations of toys. And then what they're doing is they document on their dog's kennel sheet which type of toys the dog appears to interact with mostly. And then they're also tracking what type of enrichment does this dog enjoy mostly. So if we have that dog there for longer than a week, let's say, as they're maybe getting spayed and neutered, if they're getting vaccinated, all of those things, The longer the dog stays, they can start to kind of work in the pieces that the dogs seem to enjoy most, and we can kind of figure it out. I don't know if you've ever brought, I don't know if you've ever brought a new dog home. I don't know what, of course you have. But typically when we bring a new dog home, you might buy all these things for them and then they disregard it. They don't like it. So then you go to the store and you're picking up something else and you donate the old thing or, you tend to get a variety of things. And then the more your dog settles in, you kind of figure out what their preferences are. And so when we're thinking about that in our shelters, we want to do something really similar. And because there's so many hands in the pot all the time, we've got different handlers, different volunteers walking dogs, all of these things. Some of those little detailed nuances can really get lost in transition. So if we're able to create, even if it's just for the first 3 days or the first week, depending on your shelter size, you can just grab quick little snapshots. I usually recommend shelters do a circle box because that's the easiest thing to do. I carry a pen in my hair like this most of the time when I'm working in the shelter. So when I take a dog out and I bring them back and I put them up and if I have a note or I see that they've engaged with a specific enrichment item or they came to me with a toy in their mouth, I can just make a quick circle and say this dog likes this ball, those types of things. And that way, by the end of that week or 2 weeks or 3 days, whatever it may be, we're able to kind of start identifying what is actually helping this dog as an individual coping with the stress of the new environment that they're in. So that's some ways that we can kind of think about giving dogs choice and autonomy about their environment and then communicating that to us, documenting it, and then helping other people. So when they go to, let's say, clean the kennel and they have to take the ball out because it rolled in poop, or, the stuffed toy that they were chewing on kind of is fluffed into pieces, we can go to our shelf of donated dog toys and try to pull ones that are very similar to the ones that we do have to wash. And that's a good way that you can keep that consistency for that animal with the things that they enjoy and like. So, some other really small things that we can do to increase some of the predictability around the operational processes when we really think about our animals in our own homes and houses is structure and routine tends to be very helpful for them, especially when they're coming in and they're new. So we work on things like crate training, or we might block off the kitchen so they don't get into the garbage. And we might start taking them out at a certain time of day. We might start taking them for walks, or, they go to daycare twice a week or whatever. So for dogs that are in our shelter, especially if they're staying for more than 2 weeks, I think at a point where a dog is 2 weeks into a shelter stay, we need to kind of throw out the idea, I guess the hourly idea that this dog is a homeless animal. I would really love for shelters to start thinking about this is this dog's home. And I think reframing that in our mind makes us a little bit more empathetic to realizing that this is their home until their next place. And so we have to try to make this as close to a home as we can for them and think about all those things that you would be giving your dog in the home. So we would be creating those routines and the predictability, but we would also be supplying our dogs with those other needs that they have, which is exercise, enrichment, fulfillment, scent engagement, all of those things kind of we need to, I think, start thinking about those things for dogs in their shelter stay, especially after we hit that 2 week mark. So some things that we can think about that would create, I should say, some predictability for the dogs is saying hello to the dog as you approach the kennel instead of just opening the door, leashing them, and taking them out. And I know that a lot of us do this just naturally, but impressing that upon the whole team to have something even like a structured keyword or a cue, if we're thinking about the ways that dogs learn, it's through association, right? So if we're all saying different things or approaching the kennel in a different way, and this goes, I think, to say like, well, actually, I'll come back to that. But even providing something as a simple cue, like we're going outside now and tossing a treat and then entering the kennel to leash them and practicing that with each individual dog, the more the dog is staying, the more that they're going to predict that they're being taken out of their kennel to go outside. And that anticipation, if outside is reinforcing and fun for them is going to become a positive anticipation, or the anticipation builds up positive feelings. And so we're increasing that dog's positive feelings. If we're running around the kennel and dogs are getting taken out and it's different people, we're using different equipment. So there's some shelters I've been to that staff all use slip leads, but the volunteers use harnesses, and that can be confusing for dogs. It might be a little different if maybe in the morning we all use slip leads to run the dogs out, so the dogs get used to that. So it's like potty time is the slip lead. But then if the staff is still going throughout the day and moving dogs on a slip lead, but everybody else is moving the dogs on the harness, that creates a level of unpredictability, especially if they haven't been able to distinguish like who does what. So one of the things that I noticed working in large shelters with populations that would stay for long periods of time is through actually having shirts that all match, colored shirts. So whether that's just all blue or all gray or all red, because that helps for the animals separate. You're a person that is here to take me out for a walk. You're a person who's here to take me out for playgroup versus you're a potential person to come want to adopt me. And the first time I actually recognized that this is something that dogs would utilize as a cue was one organization I worked with. The volunteers had different colored shirts than the staff members. And the dogs knew very well, based on seeing the whatever color shirt was walking through the building, that they would react to. And the reason I know that it wasn't just because it was a specific person in the shirt was because this was a situation in which they had staff rotating in and out. It was a deployment type situation. And so they just didn't, it wasn't the person they were reacting to, it was just them seeing the color shirt. And when they saw staff coming, they knew that they were usually getting something very exciting, like a walk or enrichment or some one-on-one time, whereas the volunteers were there mostly for cleaning. So the kennels were actually very quiet around cleaning time when all the volunteers would be out cleaning because they knew that nothing exciting was going to be happening for them. However, the second somebody with a different color shirt, the staff shirt, would walk into a pod, they were like, game on. Is it me? Am I the one going out? So, like, that predictability for the dogs created a completely different level of noise and excitement and arousal for the dogs in the kennel, just based alone on them being used to the color of the t-shirt that folks were wearing and what their job roles were. I think we underestimate dogs quite a bit. So it's just an example there of how creating predictability can actually affect the behavior, because behavior is a reflection of what is going on in the environment. And dogs are very nuanced and being able to pick up on these small, very subtle details. So, like I said, going back to like having a cue word before you take all the dogs out and getting them used to that can be something instead of a t-shirt color. Something like when you take a dog out, making sure that they have a treat to come back to. So like a milk bone even, or mint on a pillow is what some folks refer it to. So just as you're getting the dog out, taking a milk bone and tossing it into the kennel so when they come back in, they get that every single time, can be a game changer because it creates a level of predictability. Even if the dog doesn't eat the treat necessarily, it is something that they know is going to be in their kennel. A really great example of utilizing like a return to kennel treat to create a peaceful moment, predictability. One shelter that I worked with would do cleaning in the mornings, and they would flip all the dogs to one side, feed them on that side, and then flip all the other dogs to the back after the food was done. And then they would go through and clean. And when they finished cleaning, they would put a nylabone with peanut butter into the kennel. And then the dog would be let back in, and that became the thing that they had. No one was allowed to go back into that dog's kennel for 30 minutes. And so those dogs all learned over the time that they started getting into that routine, is learning I have 30 minutes to really settle into this treat and enjoy it without being disturbed. And what would happen then is as everybody was finishing cleaning and they were starting to flip the dogs up to the front, you just heard total silence for about an hour or so, depending on where they were with the cleaning. And that level of predictability gave those dogs a time in the shelter to know that they had 30 minutes of their own peace and quiet to get into their enrichment, eat the peanut butter, and hang out without having somebody come up and toss treats at them, without having somebody up and like flicking the door handle or medical coming in and delivering medications. It was just they had that time and it was for themselves. And then after that time slot, the cleaning block was done, then they would start taking all the dogs out for their afternoon activities. So yeah, so all of those things that kind of create that nice predictability around the kennel environment, we can do the same thing with sound. So like 11 a.m. every day could be sound time in which we're rotating different noises from a sound machine. Again, that is something dogs will start to begin to predict the longer they're in the shelter is those anticipation of those activities. And we're for keeping them really positive, that could be really that can help build that positive anticipation. I'm looking forward to something versus I have to be on guard all the time because I don't exactly know what is happening next. So we're going to talk about now some ways that dogs develop coping mechanisms for the stress that they're enduring. So, or don't. Like, I mean, that's the thing is like some dogs just really spiral in the shelter. And that's why I think it's important to identify what some of the coping mechanisms are. So, if you see a dog doing something that is what is likely a stress coping mechanism, we can identify it and say, hey, this dog is struggling and needs help. The first biggie for me, and I was actually just talking to Trish McMillan and also Tom Candy about this very recently, was dogs who are biting on the leash and climbing it. For me, that is a really, really big sign that a dog is struggling. The biting and holding and grabbing of things is not something you will often see from a dog that lives in a home environment or even out in the real world once they've been out for a while. It is really only something I see from dogs in a shelter environment. So what that tells me is that that behavior is likely just linked directly to the stress that the animal is experiencing in the shelter. Yes, an animal might leave the shelter with that behavior and then it needs to be worked on and then it dissipates typically once the dog decompresses and maybe has had some training if it becomes that ingrained of a learned behavior. But typically those behaviors start when the dog is in the shelter. And so if we're able to recognize that as a sign that this animal is very struggling and having a hard time is displacing anxiety into this grabbing behavior that can, as we all know, can then lead to grabbing clothes and can become very dangerous. There are ways that we can pivot and like get to management and say, hey, like what other things can we do for this dog? What is causing this dog's like fear, because most of the time we think it's high arousal, and it is. It comes from all the things going on in the environment and the dog's physiological arousal, yes, but it's often coming from a place of fear of being frightened and not having anywhere to cope with that. So, things that we can do is obviously we can talk to our vet care team to see if there's some supplements or medications that we can help calm the nervous system with. We can attack it from a multifaceted approach, which is where kind of the operational pieces come in. We can also think about, is it the location of the kennel that like maybe it's the noise is aversive and the loudness of this space? Is there an area of the kennel room where the dog won't have dogs walking past it all the time? Is it because the dog isn't getting adequate exercise and they're frustrated? Can we add them to a priority list for dog walks or play groups, or maybe you have a field trip club or a doggy day out type of thing? What happens with dogs who start doing a lot of leash grabbing is we tend to reduce the amount of handlers handling them for safety, and then that in turn then increases some of that. We may also see that we start putting chain leashes on the dog and so they can't grab the leash, and then what results in that, because we're not really addressing those underlying issues of why they're grabbing the leash, we might start seeing them grabbing clothing and getting more frustrated. So can we think of ways in which we can still have volunteers interact with this dog that is safe? So can we do any protected contact or like half protected contact where like trained staff member is able to bring the dog to a yard, and then we have like an X pen set up so that the volunteer can stay behind the X pen and like play fetch with the dog. And then they can call on the radio for the staff member to come back and help move the dog back to the kennel. Just thinking outside the box for these dogs to try to figure out what it is that's causing that behavior and meeting the needs. And then, of course, documenting all of that as you go along. If you move the dog's kennel location and they're behaving exactly the same way, it's not the kennel location maybe then that's causing that behavior. So we have to dive deeper. So again, that documentation and tracking is what's going to be very helpful in those scenarios. And again, when we're looking at shelters, we're really busy. Maybe we don't have behavior staff on site. The smallest thing we can do is just document. So if I think one of the biggest hiccups I see in shelters is that, we want to be able to document things quickly, especially when we have staff and volunteers who are very busy moving around, and then it gets documented in writing and then doesn't get into a computer or the information doesn't travel up the line. And so there's so much technology now, which is awesome. So you can use something like a Google form or some online type of submission, and you can just kind of put a QR code in your kennel area that just lets people use their phones that goes straight to a form. It says like dog's ID number, dog name, observation. They can just type it on their phone or use talk to text and then hit send, and then it goes somewhere to a management team that can just like enter data, but at least it's getting into the hands of someone who's outside of the on the ground direct stuff to upper level management who can kind of take all of these observations and put them in. Other things that you'll start seeing from dogs that are coping mechanisms are if we start to see any spinning, if we start to see any dog who's kind of like jumping up and like treading and jumping up and treading and moving back. One of the more severe signs that I've seen is dogs who will pace at the front and start to tip their head up in the corners. So those are oftentimes behaviors we might see in zoos from captive animals who are not able to have their needs met. And ways that we can reduce that is again through providing more agency in the environment and more things for the animal to do. So we may look at a dog who is starting to display those types of behaviors and say, what can we do to supplement this dog's time? So a good example is a dog that my colleague Emily, my ride or die, when we were at a shelter in Florida, we were walking through to kind of pick some dogs out for playgroup, and we noticed this dog was licking the wall repeatedly, and he was trying to bite on it. They had forget what brand of kennels they are, but it's like I don't know if it's fiberglass, but it wasn't a cement wall. Like they had those nice like metal kennels. On the outside they were raised off the floor a little bit, and the walls are almost like plasticky. I can't think of the material right now, but he was just obsessively doing this, and we were asked, yeah, it was probably fiberglass, Trish, something like that. It was kind of like a plastic that you would see on maybe outdoor play equipment, like that kind of like thick rubber plasticky stuff. Anyways, so as we're walking by, we see this dog, and people in the kennels were just walking by like this was no big deal because I just don't think that they recognized that this dog was in severe distress. I just don't think they had had the training in knowing what those signals looked like. So we pulled the dog out of the kennel. He's like overheated. I don't know how long he had been licking the walls for that particular day, but it was very clear this was a really challenging thing, or this is something he had been doing for a long time, and it was going to be a really challenging behavior to break. So the rest of that day he spent in the office. But once we had him pulled out of the kennel, we also recognized he had massive ear infections that had gone unnoticed. So he had medical things going on. And then he also, we found out, had severe separation anxiety. So licking the walls was his coping mechanism for being really stressed. And we found somebody who in the shelter who said that they'd be willing to keep him in the office during the daytime, and then they prioritized him on the foster list. Once you're able to identify that these dogs are, and everybody is trained on what they're looking at, you and have everybody can come together and say, what can we do now to address this challenge? Okay, let's treat the ear infections. Let's get this dog on some sedatives to like help him until we figure out a plan. Let's get him office time. And now let's also make sure we prioritize him on a foster list. So he did end up going out to foster. They sent out an email. They put it on their social media. Like we have a dog who's really needs decompression space. And, he ended up going into that foster home. We didn't see any of the wall licking. He was able to be pulled off his meds. The ear medication got treated. And then they were actually able to work on some of his separation anxiety. So I think he was in foster for about 2 weeks. No, I'm sorry. He was in foster for about 3 weeks. And then he was actually able to be adopted into a home with like follow-up post-adoption support from the shelter. So, if we're able to identify these dogs that are really struggling and developing these coping mechanisms, we can intervene. So, the first step there is obviously training on what different levels of stress look like. And I do really enjoy utilizing the FAS scoring from Fear Free Shelters for this too. Because again, when we're thinking about documenting observations and making sure that we are looking at each animal as an individual. What's nice about the FAS scale is when we are just using strict observational data, sometimes even with that, like our opinions can be skewed a little because we're often seeing all of our animals in some type of stress. All of them are giving us whale eyes during certain points of the day, and it can be, you can fall into this, I guess, fallacy of it skews our baseline, right? Being able to use the FAS because it does have very objective things that you're seeing in the dog, it allows us to just like circle a number or input a number into our thing. And then when the manager comes around and takes a look, you can start to track like, oh, this dog's at like a 2 for like a week, and all of a sudden somebody documents a 4, right? Like what happened in that spike, and we can really start to evaluate, oh, this dog's at like a 4, 3 or 4 every day. That's kind of an issue. We need to kind of get ahead of that and tackle it, or this dog's behavior is going to decline. So we know that the outcome of chronic stress leads to behavioral decline. It happens with people too. In our shelters, dogs are all going to be sleep deprived. When they're home, they sleep most of the day. They're most active, usually first thing in the morning and be like around the evening time when the sun is setting. And those are usually the times where we come in and everybody's really excited. So first thing in the morning, they got this large excitement burst. And then typically if the dog is at home and we get to work, whatever, they kind of sleep during the day. They're on they get up, they move around, they switch beds. In the shelter, typically during the day, we're all running around like chickens with our heads cut off. And so they're losing all of that time to get sleep. And then right as we're closing up at the end of the night is when most dogs are naturally at their second most active point in the day. And we're like tossing Kongs in and leaving. So they're not going to get that sleep necessarily right away at the end of the day either. And then, if we leave, let's say at 5 and come back at 8, they're not even getting that full 16 to 18 hours of sleep that they really need every day. So the longer an animal is in our care, the more and more sleep deprived they're going to get. As you know, when you're tired, and I'm very tired, it's like, you get snappy, you get temperamental, you stop thinking as clearly, you're a lot more impulsive in your decision making, because everything just feels overwhelming. And so that is also what happens with our shelter dogs as well. So I highly recommend, if your shelter doesn't already have a time in the day where like everything just shuts down in the kennels for like an hour, I recommend you talk to your teams about that. If you're unable to do that during the week because your open hours are open all the time, consider maybe doing it on a weekend or when the shelter's closed, is having the dogs have like an hour or so. I did see one shelter try to do an experiment with like a down day where they chose Sundays to not do any activities with the dog and let them rest. But I think that threw too much of a monkey wrench into the equation because new dogs coming in hadn't been used to the schedule and they might bark all day and keep the other dogs up. And then we were like not getting dogs out. So while it was a great concept in theory, it didn't in practice really seem to work out. It's something you could certainly experiment with your shelter, but I do think having the daily schedule is going to be much more effective for the dogs as a population total than it would be for trying to just do like 3 days a week or something like that. But at the end of the day, I think doing it even if just a little bit is probably better, so we can at least offer the opportunity for dogs to have some extra rest time to try to kind of combat some of that sleep deprivation that they're experiencing. So obviously we know that shelters are scary and stressful and very hard. But if we're able to utilize predictability in any way that we are any I should say in any way that we can do throughout our daily operations, that is going to be very impactful not only for the animals, like we always think about the animals first because that's why we're here, but when the dogs are calmer and the dogs are better having their needs met, I should say, you will also see the stress relief come off of the staff. Like the shelters in which I go to, which have implemented these predictable routines and strategic kind of enrichment rotations. So the dogs are getting enrichment every day, but maybe they're getting a different type every day. So they get a Kong on one day, they get a frisbee hung on the front of their kennel the next day. Maybe they get a busy box the third day. The predictability combined with some of the novelty is very helpful. So some days it might be a scent enrichment, etc. The dogs start to anticipate that things are coming and they physiologically go, okay, I'm going to stop barking now because I know in like 5 minutes my enrichment is coming and then I can get into that and have it for a while. So being able to offer that to dogs is super cool and helpful. There was one shelter that I was working with that before the lunch break, where everybody would leave and the dogs would have an hour of downtime, they would send one staff member, usually the lead for the day, to go through and spray lavender in front of all the kennels. And it was awesome because the dogs all would see the one person coming through and they would come up to the front of the kennel just to like sniff the lavender and then they would like creep back onto their beds. And once they had their lavender scent, they knew that the lights were going to go down and we were all going to leave for lunch. And so it was just really cool because you could, instead of the dogs getting really excited, like, oh, a person's here, they knew that that person's specific job was just to come deliver them this scent. And it reduced that overall arousal. They would get their nap time and we'd come back, and maybe one or two dogs would be barking, right? We can't have perfect silence ever in a kennel, but that was in a shelter that had like 100 and I want to say 22 dogs at the time, 22 or 23 dogs at the time. And so I personally got to see firsthand what it looked like for these dogs to kind of begin to understand. And the next question is probably going to be like, how long does it take for these dogs to get the schedule? About a week. When you constantly have new dogs coming in, it is going to take them a week or so to get onto that schedule, but they do figure it out. I think that we sometimes don't give dogs the benefit of the doubt of being pretty smart and also noticing those little nuances. And so, I do think that, yeah, they're not going to all, it's not like by day two, they're going to be like, wow, I can't wait for my scent enrichment. But the more that you're able to do it and implement it, and they can hear and they can smell and they can understand what is happening around them, the faster they kind of fall into that routine. I hope some of these things were helpful for you today, thinking about reducing stress, using behavior strategies filled with your kind of like operational daily trajectory. It was helpful. I have a lot of tricks and tips like this, and it's usually very dependent on each individual shelter's routine, their staffing, how many volunteers they have, what resources do they have for different enrichment. There's so many contingencies when we're working in shelters, but hopefully this kind of strung up some ideas for you. Think outside the box a little bit, try something new, talk to your teams, see if anybody else. That's always a good one too, is like seeing everybody else on your team. If you kind of start like spitting out ideas, if other people have ones, and then you can kind of come to a cumulative decision. That can be really helpful and really help teams, pull together for the animals. And then again, the like the shelters where I've worked in, where yeah, all the animals are stressed, but if that stress is limited to like 4 hours out of the day instead of all eight, it's just an amazing thing to see. And I would love to see more shelters being able to implement this type of stuff. It does take a philosophy change in some locations, but it's so beneficial. So just keep poking the bear. If you guys have any more interest in learning about enrichment, I did do if you guys were around, I did do a Lawless Off Leash series webinar with Mick Moeller. He created the entire enrichment program at Arizona Humane Society, and it blew my mind. I've been like doing this for a long time, and I was like, oh my God, So that is in if you purchase like the replay link. I might have even put it up there as a freebie, as a preview. So if you go to my website, you might be able to see it for free. But either way, it's like 20 bucks and I have about 13 videos in there and it's like lifetime access. So it's a really and we talk about all sorts of topics. So that is an avenue for you to go, and if you want to get more ideas, Mick is awesome. That's all I gotta say. So thank you so much. We're skipping the live next week because I will be at the Aggression in Dogs conference, and then when I get back, I'm gonna recap it in that next live. So I hope you guys all have a great rest of your week, and I'll see you in 2 weeks on Thursday. Thank you guys. Take care. I'm sorry I can't pronounce your name. It is a one-time fee. I wanted to keep that low cost so people could have lifetime access to low cost resources. So 20 bucks and you get all 13 and whatever comes in after that. All right, thanks guys. Bye.